Most people are not afraid of loud individuals. They fear the quiet ones. Have you ever noticed how some people become deeply uncomfortable around someone who speaks very little, but seems to observe everything? The strange thing about human nature is that people trust what they can easily read: a smile, a reaction, an explanation, a need for approval. But solitary people rarely give those signals away, and that is exactly what makes them unsettling. I am the Watcher, and here in Shadow Insight, we explore the hidden mechanisms behind human behavior. Because the truth is, the people who spend the most time alone often develop something others never do: a different relationship with emotions, with silence, with observation, with power itself. And most people never realize how dangerous that can become until much later. Not dangerous in the obvious sense, but psychologically dangerous, emotionally difficult to manipulate, difficult to read, difficult to control. Tonight, we are going to uncover why solitude changes people, why some individuals become unexpectedly intimidating after long periods alone, and why human nature often fears those who no longer depend on constant validation. Watch carefully until the end, because the final truth behind solitude is not what most people think. And if you recognize some of these signs in yourself, you may start seeing your own silence very differently. If this kind of psychological insight fascinates you, subscribe to Shadow Insight and tell me in the comments, do you think solitude reveals who people truly are, or transforms them into someone else entirely? At first, solitary people do not appear dangerous at all. They often seem calm, reserved, even ordinary. They are not usually the loudest person in the room. They do not constantly seek attention. They rarely fight to dominate conversations. And yet, people often feel strangely observed around them. Have you ever wondered why silence makes so many people uncomfortable? Because most social interactions rely on constant emotional feedback. People expect reactions. They expect smiles, nods, approval, small signs that reassure them they are being accepted. But solitary individuals often break this invisible social rhythm. They listen more than they speak. And with time, you begin to notice something strange. The less a person talks, the more others start revealing themselves. A talkative person exposes their intentions quickly. Their insecurities become visible. Their emotions leak naturally. But quiet people create empty space, and human beings unconsciously rush to fill empty space. That is why people often confess too much around solitary individuals without understanding why. The silence pulls information out of them. You can see this almost everywhere. At work, one employee speaks very little during meetings. He simply watches, observes reactions, remembers details. At first, nobody pays attention to him, but months later, he somehow understands every conflict in the office better than everyone else. Or in relationships, some people constantly explain themselves emotionally. They react impulsively. They seek reassurance. Meanwhile, the solitary person says almost nothing, but notices everything: tone changes, micro expressions, hidden resentment, false politeness. The strange thing about people is that they often mistake silence for weakness, but silence frequently hides analysis. And over time, this changes the balance completely. Because the person who speaks the least usually learns the most. Most people never realize how much information they reveal every single day through emotion, impulsive reactions, nervous talking, or the desperate need to be understood. But solitary people spend enormous amounts of time watching human behavior from a distance, and distance changes perception. When someone is constantly surrounded by noise, validation, and social stimulation, they react emotionally. But prolonged solitude often forces people to become observers instead of participants. And observers notice patterns others completely miss. That is when solitude slowly starts becoming power. Solitude does something most people never fully understand. It removes distraction. And once distraction disappears, people begin confronting themselves. That is why many individuals cannot tolerate being alone for very long. The silence becomes too loud. No notifications, no conversations, no external validation, no constant emotional stimulation, only their own thoughts. And for many people, that is unbearable. Have you ever noticed how quickly some individuals reach for their phone the moment silence appears? Because solitude forces self-confrontation. Jung believed that people spend much of their lives avoiding the parts of themselves they fear the most: their insecurities, their resentment, their envy, their emotional dependence. But prolonged solitude slowly removes the mask, and this changes people psychologically. Some break under it. Others become stronger in ways society rarely talks about. Because when a person spends enough time alone, they often stop depending on social approval to define themselves. And that changes their entire emotional structure. Most people are heavily influenced by the reactions of others. A compliment changes their mood, rejection destroys their confidence, attention makes them feel valuable. But solitary individuals gradually begin operating differently. They learn to regulate themselves internally, and that makes them difficult to manipulate. Why? Because emotional control usually depends on dependency. If someone desperately needs your validation, you can influence them. If someone fears losing social acceptance, you can pressure them. If someone cannot tolerate isolation, you can control their behavior through exclusion. But solitude teaches a person something dangerous: how to survive emotionally without constant reassurance. And human nature becomes deeply uncomfortable around people who no longer need approval to remain stable. Nietzsche once suggested that isolation can transform people because it forces them to build strength internally rather than socially. That strength is not always visible immediately. In fact, it often appears as emotional calmness. And calm people disturb others more than emotional people ever will. Because emotional people are predictable. You can provoke them, read them, control their reactions. But emotionally detached individuals become harder to influence, harder to intimidate, harder to emotionally trap. This is why solitary people often appear mysterious without trying to. They reveal very little, need less validation, react less impulsively, and the human brain instinctively distrusts what it cannot easily predict. The strange thing about people is that they often fear not aggression, but emotional independence, because someone who can emotionally survive alone cannot be controlled the same way as everyone else. Here's the part most people avoid talking about. Many social relationships are built on invisible emotional exchanges: approval, attention, validation, reassurance, status. Human beings constantly negotiate these things without even realizing it. A compliment creates influence, attention creates attachment, emotional reactions create leverage, and most people participate in these dynamics automatically. But solitary individuals often disrupt this entire system. Why? Because people lose power over someone who is comfortable walking away. Have you ever wondered why certain individuals become irritated when they cannot emotionally affect you? Because influence depends on reaction. A person who can provoke you controls part of your emotional state. A person who can make you seek their approval controls your behavior. A person who can make you fear rejection controls your decisions. But solitary people frequently develop a reduced fear of emotional isolation, and this changes power dynamics completely. Suddenly, manipulation becomes harder. Guilt loses effectiveness. Social pressure weakens. Emotional games stop working the same way. This is why some people secretly resent emotionally self-sufficient individuals, not because they are cruel, but because they are difficult to psychologically dominate. Adler believed that many human behaviors are driven by hidden struggles for significance and control. And once you understand this, you start seeing relationships differently. You notice how often people test boundaries emotionally. Who reacts first? Who apologizes first? Who seeks reassurance first? Who fears losing the connection more? The person who fears losing the relationship the most usually holds the least power inside it. And solitary people often become dangerous because prolonged solitude teaches them they can survive loss. That realization changes everything. The strange thing about human nature is that people admire independence publicly, but often feel threatened by it privately, especially when that independence is emotional. Because emotionally independent individuals expose something uncomfortable: how much of society operates through invisible dependency. You can see this in friendships. Someone suddenly becomes colder after realizing they can no longer manipulate your emotions. You can see it in workplaces. A calm employee who does not desperately seek validation becomes strangely intimidating to managers obsessed with control. You can see it in relationships. The moment one person emotionally detaches, the entire balance changes. And most people never notice the real reason. The danger of solitary people is not violence.
It is psychological unpredictability. They often think before reacting, observe before speaking, detach before begging. And in a world where many people are controlled through emotion, that kind of self-control becomes deeply unsettling.
But now, a more uncomfortable question appears. What if solitude has already changed you? Have you ever noticed that after spending long periods alone, certain social behaviors start looking strangely artificial? The forced laughter, the constant need for attention, the endless performance people maintain to feel accepted. With time, solitary people often become highly sensitive to emotional dishonesty because distance sharpens perception. When you stop constantly participating in social noise, you begin observing patterns more clearly. Who only contacts you when they need something? Who becomes uncomfortable when you stop chasing them? Who loses interest the moment you stop providing emotional energy? And this realization can slowly transform the way you relate to people. At first, solitude feels painful. Humans are social creatures. Rejection hurts. Isolation creates emotional tension. But then something strange happens. The mind adapts. And once a person adapts to solitude, they often stop tolerating superficial connections the same way. That is why some solitary individuals appear colder with time, not necessarily because they hate people, but because they see through behaviors more quickly now. Freud believed that much of human interaction is driven by unconscious needs people barely understand themselves. The need to feel important, desired, superior, reassured. And once you begin noticing these invisible motivations everywhere, certain interactions stop feeling genuine. This is where solitude becomes dangerous in another way, because excessive observation can slowly create emotional detachment. The solitary person starts analyzing everything, every word, every intention, every inconsistency, and eventually, trust becomes harder. The strange thing about people is that the more they understand human behavior, the more difficult complete innocence becomes. You stop reacting naturally, you anticipate motives, you expect hidden agendas, and sometimes you even isolate yourself before others can disappoint you. This is why solitude can create both wisdom and distance at the same time. It strengthens perception, but it can also quietly reduce emotional openness. And maybe that is the real danger no one talks about. Not that solitary people become monsters, but that prolonged isolation can slowly convince someone they no longer truly need anyone. And once a human being reaches that point, they begin moving through the world very differently. So, why are solitary people often perceived as dangerous? Not because they are louder, not because they are more aggressive, not because they secretly want to dominate others, but because solitude changes the relationship a person has with emotion, dependency, and human behavior itself. While most people spend their lives reacting constantly to social pressure, solitary individuals often learn to observe instead. And observation creates awareness. Awareness creates emotional control. And emotional control changes power. That was the hidden truth behind this entire discussion. The real reason solitary people unsettle others is not their silence itself, but what their silence usually represents: independence, self-regulation, detachment from constant validation. Because human nature feels safest around predictable people. People who seek approval, people who react emotionally, people who fear exclusion. But someone who has learned to emotionally survive alone becomes much harder to influence. And the moment people realize they cannot easily manipulate your emotions, their behavior toward you often changes completely. But there is another side to this truth. Solitude can create clarity, yet too much of it can slowly turn observation into emotional distance. And that is the balance most people never learn to master: to remain aware without becoming disconnected, to understand human nature without losing faith in people entirely. Because the goal is not isolation, the goal is seeing clearly. I am the Watcher, and this was Shadow Insight. If this episode made you reflect differently on silence, solitude, and human behavior, subscribe and share your thoughts below. And tell me, when someone becomes completely comfortable being alone, what exactly do they stop fearing?